like 50 Shades, like, oh, I'm going to play around with it. But they don't really want to think about people who do that as a lifestyle. And they don't want to think about what that means and why they're doing it as a lifestyle. Very similar to way people don't want to like actually think about and confront like bisexuality, and that is a legitimate, that these are things that are an affront to the power dynamics and the social dynamics that we have in terms of sexuality and gender. And they really turn those dynamics and those binaries on their head in a lot of ways, both bisexuality and BDSM. BDSM like takes the power dynamics that we have in society and says like every relationship is essentially like it deals with power. You just don't realize it. And we're going to play around with that power in a way that is like pleasurable and maybe painful but that interrogates like that power. But people don't like to. Those are two identities where people don't really like to think about them too much.
Yeah. Also, the same goes for asexuality, I think. It's also something that's completely rendered invisible.
And we have a great episode about asexuality if you want to go listen to that.
What I think is just sad for the whole of society, even people who are not bisexual, even people who don't practice BDSM, for people who are not asexual, is that each one of us can learn so much from people with other sexual identities. Yes. I learned so much from the BDSM community about consent.
Oh, yes.
Even if I don't practice BDSM, I learned so much from reading about asexuality when it comes to expressing my sexual identities, because they have when it comes to expressing my forms of attraction, because they have such a varied vocabulary of differentiating between sexual attraction and romantic attraction and aesthetic attraction. And it just enriches everyone to respect and talk with other people that have a completely different concept of their own sexuality as you do.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, the issues of consent that BDSM brings up, like it is, if you go to any BDSM club, like everything there is about consent, and they will do workshops on how to talk about consent and how to think about consent and how to really make that a central aspect of every, like all play, all scenes. And I think that that's really interesting. If we're not open to learning about different ways to talk about sexuality and different ways to talk about consent and different ways to approach identities, then we are never going to evolve as a society that appreciates people's rights and people's identities. Things have changed. Language has changed. Language is constantly evolving. It's not up to those communities to teach us how to respect them. And it's up to us to learn how to respect them. And we can come to it from a place of like lesser knowledge and say like, hey, I don't know the right way to do this, but admit that you don't know the right way to do it and then learn from that. And like, I'm not perfect and you're not perfect and none of us in this society are perfect, but being open to like learning about the best way to approach that is super important.
Yeah. As Walt Whitman said, be curious, not judgmental.
Yes.
So Brenda Howard probably is the most striking example of what I would call bi-erasure. She was such a significant part of the LGBT community, and without her, we would have no pride parades, but still very few people know her. And the reason for that is, as I said, bi-erasure and bi-invisibility. And I will only touch on this topic very briefly because we already did an episode a while ago. I think it was episode 4, if I'm correct, about bi-negativity. And also, one thing that I recommend is the wonderful podcast Stuff Mum Never Told You. Just did a 2-parter on bisexuality, and I highly, highly recommend it, because what they did is they invited bisexual people and bisexual researchers to talk about their own experiences with bi-negativity, bi-erasure, with judgment, but also talk about the research and basically about how biphobia in its most extreme like the most extreme impact of it can actually kill. And let me tell you, it is so touching. It's highly informative. It's enraging. And it's just a brilliant piece of podcasting. So please listen to it. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can just click on it and listen. Plus, if you speak German, in my other podcast, Große Töchter, I also did an episode with a bi researcher who does studies on the topic of bi negativity, on exactly that topic. So check that out too. According to Wikipedia, which is the actual creator of this podcast, they define bisexual erasure or bisexual invisibility as, quote, the tendency to ignore, remove, falsify, or re-explain evidence of bisexuality in history, academia, the news media, and other primary sources. In its most extreme form, bisexual erasure can include the belief that bisexuality does not exist. Heterosexual and gay people who engage in bisexual erasure may claim that bisexuals are either homosexual or exclusively heterosexual, closeted gay or lesbian people who wish to appear heterosexual, or are heterosexuals who are experimenting with their sexuality. A common manifestation of bisexual erasure is a tendency for bisexuals to be referred to as heterosexual when they are intimately involved with people of the opposite sex, and to be labeled as homosexuals when they are involved with people of the same sex. And that is actually also something that happens to celebrities when you think about it. So I think one of the most famous examples is Freddie Mercury, who was a bisexual man, who was in relationships with women, who was even in a long-term relationship with a Viennese woman. Wasn't me. But he's usually referred to as gay. Also people like, I don't know, Anna Paquin. There's a very notable interview with, what's his name? Larry, I forgot his name. Like the host with the glasses, the very old man who looks like a small goblin a bit. Larry,
I don't know what you're talking
do you know who
about.
I mean? We'll cut that out. Wait, no, I'm going to have a look. Anna Paquin.
Larry King.
Yes, exactly.
I love the description of Larry King as a goblin.
He does look a bit like a goblin.
Oh my god, that's hilarious.
I'm not goblin shaming him. Goblins are nice. So he asked her in an interview that you can watch on YouTube, because she's married to a man now and she's in a monogamous relationship with her husband. And he was like, so you are straight now. You were bisexual. And then she goes on to explain how she's still bisexual because being bisexual also can imply being in a relationship with a man. So, yeah. So this also happens to celebrities. Yeah, but I don't want to go into details about what bi-negativity and bi-invisibility means because, as I said, we've already talked about this. Others have talked about this more eloquently than I ever could. But I want to talk about how all of that relates to Brenda Howard. So the LGBTIQ community as we know it today, or at least its mediated image, is mostly spearheaded by young, white, able-bodied cisgender men.
Yeah.
At least its representation. And bisexual people, particularly bisexual women, who make a very huge part of the of the LGBT community in general, and particularly those who don't give many fucks about respectability politics, like marriage for all, are often made invisible. And Brenda Howard was such a woman. She was a bisexual woman. She was not very marketable. She lived a polyamorous life. At the same time, the gay rights movement fought for the right to marry. She was very radical. She was very militant. She was feminist. She practiced BDSM. And also, I think basically we have to think about the difference between gay rights and queer liberation.
Oh, yeah.
So the former campaigns for inclusion into existing institutions, most prominently, especially recently, the right to marry. And the latter, queer liberation, wants more radical structural change. And it calls into question those very institutions and the patriarchal, queerphobic, capitalist foundations these institutions are built upon. So gay rights is very much about respectability politics. If you look at the whole discourse around gay marriage, it was based on the idea of we are normal, we're just like you, we also want a monogamous nuclear family and a dog and a cat and a picket fence, and there's nothing scary or radical about us, right? And doing so, gay rights, and I intentionally say gay rights and not gay and lesbian rights, because the gay rights movement also does, in fact, focus heavily on men. Another thing that I criticize. So doing so, the gay rights movement also perpetuates normative ideas about sexuality, about relationships, about love, about family, about kinship, about monosexuality, about monogamy, all of that.
I have a friend who actually we all know her, Amy Dreyer. She used to organize the Denver Pride Parade, and I know, or Pride celebrations generally. And I know from her and from my experience of Pride this year here in the DC area that it is, it is more inclusive probably than it has been in the past, but it is definitely like it's corporate sponsored. It's a lot of like gay white men, or gay men period, but often gay white men who are like very pleased with themselves, and it doesn't allow a lot of space for people who are not gay white cis men.
Who probably have relationships that are not normative, that are not monogamous, all of that.
Agreed.
But I think the fact that Pride events are like corporate sponsored has a lot to do with why it's mostly gay white men who are like visible, because that's also the demographic group within the LGBTIQ community that is the most affluent.
Yeah.
And they can be targeted by, and they're mostly targeted by advertising, etc., etc. So I think the reason why we mostly see gay white men in the media is capitalism, basically.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah. So Brenda Howard, she was a radical sex-positive feminist, polyamorous BDSM practitioner. She was probably not exactly the best figurehead when your prime goal is the right to marry. So I think she, in many ways, has also been forgotten very intentionally. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So I think, in our society, we generally have a huge problem with monosexism, which is the assumption that everyone is monosexual, which means only sexually interested in one sex or one gender expression, which is just a falsity. 75% of the LGBTIQ community is bisexual. And again, most of them are women, which might also play a part in why they are rendered invisible. So, yeah, please listen to the podcast episodes that I recommended. That probably helps contextualize everything I just said. And also I think we have to start acknowledging the huge part that bisexual people and non-monosexual people of all kinds play in the LGBTIQ community and in broader society, and the contributions they have made and keep making in, in the LGBT rights movement.
Yeah. I mean,
and Brenda Howard is just the best example for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We on our podcast can do our part in raising the visibility of individuals who played an important role in LGBTQ history, but particularly in identities that have been marginalized and continue to be marginalized within the movement. Because it's not just one movement, it's multiple movements, and the if we call it like the movement, generally we are necessarily excluding those people who don't identify with the leaders of if we even have leaders of the movement itself. So, bringing up the issues and bringing up the identities of people who have been marginalized, people who continue to be marginalized is really important. And I think that's part of why we wanted to do this episode about Marsha P. Johnson and Brenda Howard, is because they are individuals who were part of Pride, part of the Stonewall riots that we are just now starting to recognize and raise up their identities as people who are critical to our understanding and to whom we owe a lot of gratitude for the work that they did and the work that people continue to do in their name.
Yeah, exactly. And I would like to end with a quote by Tom Limoncelli, said that in 2005, "The next time someone